Hello, biologists. Welcome to Lecture 5. We're going to talk about the climate and weather and how they are the same and different, and they're mostly different, but they have similar themes. So with this beautiful image of a rainstorm, let's get started. First, I want to remind us how we organize things when we're thinking about ecology. So we have individuals, which are one organism. Those organisms are grouped into species. So all of the species of one type in one place at one time is a population. So here, the individual is one elk, assuming that's an elk, and a population is all of the elk of the same species in one place at one time. Or, for example, all of the squirrels on Mount Hood Community College's campus at one time. Then if you look at more than one species, so all of the elk and the rabbits and the owls and the bobcats and the beaver, whatever's being shown in that image, that's a community, but we're still looking just at the living species. So this is just the biotic factors. We get to an ecosystem when we start considering the abiotic factors. The abiotic factors are really what's going to influence climate and weather. So this is the level we're at. We're at the ecology level. The biotic and the abiotic together is the ecosystem. If we look at all of the organisms and the abiotic factors in several places that have similar themes, we get a biome. So a biome are places on Earth that have similar climates and similar types of organisms that live there. Maybe not the same organisms, but similar types. And I'll show you an example in a minute. Then if we look at all the biomes together, all the life and all the abiotic factors on Earth, we get the biosphere. It is the only biosphere that we know of so far. One Earth, one biosphere. So I want you to start thinking about these things and coming up with ideas about how they work. So here is a beautiful forest. Picture yourself going for a hike on it. And then what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and I want you to come up with 5 biotic factors that exist in this ecosystem and 5 abiotic factors. So we're going to practice identifying them. Go ahead and pause. Lovely. So the biotic factors that I thought of were trees, so plants. Specifically, those look like they might be some willows, and then I see some conifers in the background. Then if we have plants, we have fungi. So that was my second biotic factor, is thinking about fungi. And I could just name 5 species of fungus, and that would be enough, but just to get bigger picture. If we have plants and we have fungus, then we have bugs. If we have bugs, we probably have birds. If we have birds, we may have some rodents like some squirrels or some chipmunks. If we have those, maybe we have larger herbivores like deer. And if there's deer, maybe there's carnivores. So maybe there's some coyotes or some bobcats. Not necessarily that be shown in this picture, but I could imagine those creatures living in this environment. It looks like the right habitat for them. The abiotic factors, first I thought sunshine, because I can see the sun really clearly. So that's not living. So sunlight. Then plants need water. So there's got to be a good amount of water here. That's my second abiotic factor. I see the soil. So I'm thinking about minerals in the soil. I'm thinking about the pH in the soil. I'm thinking about what kind of rock substrate is under there. All sorts of cool things. Yeah. So that was one environment. Now let's do the same thing for this one. Try and think of 5 biotic and 5 abiotic. It's harder, right? This environment isn't green, isn't luscious. What makes this so different? The answer is heat, right? That looks hot and it looks dry, so moisture level. And if you're dry, then you don't have a lot of plants. I see a couple plants. And if there's plants, then there's got to be fungus and bugs. So they exist, but we're not seeing a ton of them. And it's harder to think of a huge web of organisms that live here because the organisms that live in these environments in these different biomes are controlled by the amount of moisture and the amount of temperature. Here's another one. We can't forget about the ocean. So think of 5 biotic and 5 abiotic factors in this habitat. Was this one easier than the desert? What about the abiotic factors? Was it harder to come up with abiotic factors when you can't see the soil? Because there's still ground somewhere down there. And now what I want you to do, since you've done this exercise, you're practicing thinking about these ideas, is look at all 3 together and imagine if you were standing in each of those, how would you know it was winter? How would you know it was summer? Would it look different in winter and summer? Would you be able to see seasonal change in one place but not the other? So these big ideas, I want to bring into the concept of climate and weather because it helps us position what we're thinking about and try and see the whole large picture here when we start talking about ecology. So let's get our definitions down. Weather is short-term atmospheric conditions in an area, one area. It's usually measured in days, so that's the short-term part. We're looking at temperature, we're looking at precipitation, which means the amount of rainfall. We're looking at how windy it is, how humid it is, whether or not it's sunny or overcast. Like Portland, it's usually overcast. In contrast, climate is weather over a long period of time. So we're not talking about days, we're talking about decades. That means total rainfall per decade, total solar radiation, which is sunlight per decade, average temperature. So not daily fluctuations, like not something that you can track on your weather app, but bigger picture things. In fact, it gets so big that we start thinking about global movement of air, global movement of currents, ocean currents. Yeah, climate is a major feature of the Earth's surface. It's not a daily variation. So that's the big difference that we want to highlight. And let's start talking about climate a little bit more. Here is an example of some biomes. You can see that we are between the 30 degrees and 45 degrees above and below the equator. And each area that's highlighted green is a Mediterranean biome. So I love the Mediterranean biome. I'm from California, and so it's my home biome. And the Mediterranean biome is characterized by hot, dry summers and cool, moist winters. Not cold, like not snow, but cool and moist. Not lots of rain, just moist, so not wet. And in each of these locations, because the biome's the same, you end up getting really similar species. So check this out. This is California, Chile, Spain, South Africa, and each one of these places has similar plants. We call them shrubs. They're usually between 0.5 and 1.5 meters tall, so usually shorter than an adult person. And they're tough, they're leathery, they tend to be evergreen, so they don't lose their leaves in the winter. And they're found all over, even if they're not closely related. They're found in the same locations because they're adapted to the same biomes. Here we have the major biomes of Earth. Do you see the trends? They seem to go in strips. So I showed you 30 to 45 latitude and longitude was where we found Mediterranean biomes. Now the top is where you find tundra, which is really cold, really frozen most of the time, has this really cool stuff called permafrost layer. Then we have taiga, which is the next strip, and that's over the top of North America, and you see Asia and Russia. And then if you go down, that bright green tropical rainforest, that's only really found around the equator. So these trends tend to stick with the latitude, going east to west, not north to south. So there seems to be a trend with that. And I'll tell you the reason why It's because of solar radiation. It's pretty neat. Oregon has our own biomes. So here you can see the different organization of biomes. We've got that coastal area. Then we have that dark green, which is Doug fir forest. It's my personal favorite habitat. Really beautiful sword ferns, lots of fungus. You can see subalpine forest is that red strip. And then over to the right in Eastern Oregon, you've got ponderosa pine and Western juniper. So different biomes, and those are based on the temperature and the moisture levels in Oregon. If we wanted to think big picture about biomes, we pretty much can control them with two things, temperature and moisture. So we have this pyramid here, and in the bottom left, you have hot and wet. That's going to be a rainforest. That's going to be what's right over the equator. And then at the top, you have cold and like medium wet. That would be tundra. At the bottom, you have wet, medium wet, but hot. That would be savanna. And then over at the bottom right, you have dry, but hot. So that's desert. So all these different biomes are controlled by how much water is available and what the average temperatures are like over a decade or more. Remember, not daily, but over a long period of time. I've mentioned that solar radiation plays a big role in our climate, and this kind of explains why the poles are cold, but the middle is warm. So we had that tropical rainforest over the equator, and then we had tundra and Arctic on the North Pole and the South Pole. And that's because if you look at this Earth right here, it's our Earth. Look at the Earth right here. The sun is putting out photons, solar radiation, heat, all that UV light, and it is hitting the Earth directly. And so this is a strong intensity light. This is the equator where the light strikes the Earth straight on. So this is going to be hotter. It's more intense sunlight. Up here and down here, but toward the poles, the Earth is rounded. And so not all of the sun light hits it straight on. It kind of deflects off. If you could imagine taking a hose and spraying a big balloon or a big ball, if you sprayed it right straight on, you would be able to push the ball around. But if you sprayed it kind of on the edge, the ball wouldn't move as fast because you're not hitting it directly. Same thing with the sun's rays. You're just lightly skimming it. So not all of the solar radiation hits it directly. It kind of rolls over the top of it. And that's why the poles are colder. They're just getting less intense sunlight. It's pretty impressive. Luckily for us, our Earth is not at a perfect up and down angle. It's at a tilt. And that tilt kind of explains seasons. So check this out. This is a seasonal configuration of the sun and the Earth. Down here you have the sun. This is the Earth. And we are rotating around the sun. When the northern hemisphere, which is above the equator, north of the equator, is pointing toward the sun, we call it summer. We have longer days, we have warmer temperatures. Now we're going to continue around the sun. One rotation is a year. In the fall, still pointing this direction. In the winter, still pointing this direction. But notice now that the northern hemisphere is pointed away from the sun. So there is less solar radiation during the winter. When we rotate, it still stays in this axis. And that's what gives us seasons. This is a view of the average temperature of Earth. It's in Celsius. You can see the scale bar on the bottom. That solar radiation really makes a difference. That middle line where it's orange and red is where the direct rays of the sun are hitting Earth straight on. Now, how do animals that live north or south of the equator respond to it being colder? I mean, the closer to the poles you go, the more there's fluctuations and chilliness and like dangers of snow and freezing. And so some animals have some really cool adaptations that I want to tell you about. The first is the bear. So you've probably heard what bears do during the winter. They hibernate, which means they find a nice little home and they sleep undisturbed for a nice long time. During this hibernation, they do not eat, they do not drink, they do not urinate or defecate. They just kind of sit there, but they have to have a lot of fat packed on before then. So before they go into hibernation, they eat enough food to gain 3 pounds of fat per day to sustain themselves during hibernation. And during hibernation, they can lose 25 to 40% of their body weight. So they still use energy, they're just using a lot less. And they have to pack it on before so they don't starve during this hibernation period. A cool fact about bears, if a female bear has a fertilized egg before she goes into hibernation, she'll put it on pause. She'll just hold it for weeks or months until she's done, and then she can implant it, because if she starts to develop a baby during hibernation, she could theoretically starve to death while feeding that embryo. Over on the right, we have a woodpecker. You may have seen these trees. We have these kind of woodpeckers in our area. It's creating an acorn granary, or a granary tree, and it's saving up those acorns for later, for in the winter or when food gets scarce. So that's another behavioral trait that allows woodpeckers to live in areas where there may be fluctuations in food abundance. These two chubby squirrels on the left are preparing for winter by packing on fat, just like our bear did, but they also develop thicker coats. Can you see that their fur is really dense looking? That's the winter coat. Your dog or cat might do a similar thing. They layer in a thicker coat for winter and then lose it in the summer and spring. On the bottom right, we have a ground squirrel. Ground squirrels don't hibernate per se, but they go into a phase called torpor. And in torpor, their body temperature can drop as low as 27 degrees Fahrenheit. That's below freezing. They basically freeze and wait, and then wake up. On the left is the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern will migrate instead of staying in a cold environment, and it has the longest migration on Earth. It migrates 12,000 miles, which is just incredible. And another bird adaptation to really cold is the penguin. They make penguin huddles. You can find videos of this online. Basically, they all wrap together and they snuggle, but they snuggle and also shimmy so that they can keep some movement warmth. So here they've clustered all their babies together into a snuggle pile so that they stay warm. All right, so factors that are contributing to Earth's biomes are solar radiation, moisture levels, and then we have this thing called convection cells. Let's talk about that now. Here's the Earth. Here's the equator. Here's 45 degrees-ish. That's where Portland is. Along the equator, we know that we get the most solar radiation, so that's the hottest area. What happens to hot air? It rises. So the hot air rises, it kind of pushes out. As it goes upward, it gets colder. As it cools, it falls, and then it can get warmed again and lift up, and then it can get cold again and fall. And so this kind of creates these twirling motions of air in our atmosphere, which we call convection cells. What's really cool about this is it also explains these patterns of biomes. Warm air, lots of moisture, lots of rain. I don't know if you can see this rain cloud right here. That leads to warm, wet environment, which is a tropical rainforest. Then you drop all your moisture, so it's drier. The air doesn't have moisture here. It can cool down, pick up more moisture, warm up, pick up more moisture, drop more rain. And then by the time it gets to the poles, it's drier again. We can see this pattern in our area. So I said we're about 45 degrees latitude. That would be us right here. Not quite boreal, but definitely Doug fir conifer rainforest. And then Death Valley in California, closer to the desert. There's less moisture in the air because of these convection cells. This also leads to wind patterns. So over on the left, we have a theoretical, idealized Earth. This is like what the diagrams show. Over on the right, this is what it actually looks like. And this is the one I'm interested in talking about. So inside is the Earth. You can kind of see the North America shape down there. It's down there. And then you have the intertropical conversion zone. You have the northeast trade winds. You have the subtropical high. You have the westerlies. You may have heard these words when hearing about navigation or about planes or about ships, because you have to take all of these winds and speeds and movements into consideration when you're navigating. But check this out. This convection cell, they happen in 3 main chunks. This convection cell is called a Hadley cell. The one above it's a Ferrel cell, and then the polar cell. It's the same on the bottom. So you have 2 Hadley cells, 2 Ferrel cells, 2 polar cells. The warm air rises. As it rises, it cools. As it cools, it condenses and it drops rain. So it's losing its rain. And then cold, dry air falls down but gets warmed again. And so you get this convection cycle happening. And that leads to all these different wind movements. We also have this really incredible thing called the rain shadow effect. We have this in our area. Here is a Cascade Mountain. Those are our mountains. We have moisture-laden water or moisture-laden air from the ocean. And as it comes toward the Cascades, the mountains push the air upward. And as the air is pushed upward, it gets colder, which means the water condenses and the water falls as rain. And by the time the air gets over the peak of the Cascades, all the air is dry. And so the west side of the mountain will be totally wet and luscious, and the east side of the mountain will be drier. And you know the habitat difference between Western Oregon and Eastern Oregon. And if you want to look at it on Google Maps, it looks like this. That's the rain shadow. All of that wet, moist air came up, lost its moisture, and then moved on as dry air. So that totally affects our biomes in Oregon. Another thing that's important for our biomes and our climate on Earth is the ocean currents. So we're not going to talk a huge amount about them, but I do think it's really fascinating that there are general trends in the way that the ocean water moves. It doesn't just kind of sit there. It definitely swirls in a pattern, and you can predict it. So here we have the Pacific stream, which this swirl right here is part of why we have the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Everything that gets thrown into the oceans around here kind of just swirls, and as it swirls, the particulate condenses toward the center. And in the center, we have this massive pile of garbage. It's the Pacific Garbage Patch. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about habitat degradation and loss of biodiversity. So later in the term, we'll talk about that. Have you ever wondered why the water on Earth doesn't evaporate off into space? Maybe I'm the only one that's wondered about this. But I definitely was like, wait, why does it stay? And the answer of why it stays, and maybe you know this, is we have an atmosphere. An atmosphere is really incredible. The atmosphere is actually keeping life on Earth alive because it keeps the water on Earth. And without the water, there's no life as far as we know so far. Our atmosphere is pretty cool. It's mostly nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and then trace amounts of other things. It's divided up in 4 layers. And some divide even further because the outermost one would be like the exosphere that's outside of the atmosphere. So you could count it as one. We exist in the troposphere. That's the only part that we ever really go into. And then meteors are in the mesosphere. If you've ever seen the Northern Lights, that's in the thermosphere. What I really think is interesting is on the right, we have this graph of temperature. Starts around 20 Celsius down here on the surface of Earth. And then as you get higher, it does this awesome zigzag pattern. So it gets colder. Like, you know, if you open the door of an airplane, commercial airline, you get frostbite and die. That's the cold part, but then it heats up again, and then it gets cold again, and then it heats up again, which is so interesting. All right, that's climate and weather. So I hope that was fun, and email me with questions. I can't wait to see what you're gonna ask this week. Have a good one.